Words from the Gospel. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. In the name of God, Source, Word, and life-giving Spirit. Amen. So I was getting ready for Remembrance Sunday, a Sunday when we not only remember those who died in the First World War, but those who have died in all conflicts and continue to die in the conflicts in our world today. I kind of took stock and had a little bit of a think and thought, this has not really been a very easy year for those who are trying to be peacemakers. Thought a little bit about the situation that's happening in Ukraine. Thought about Russia and Ukraine and how it's called a meat grinder, telling us of the great loss of life that's happening in that terrible war. Thought a little bit about what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and in fact in the wider Middle East, as that conflict and war spreads and grows to encompass many other nations, and the shocking loss of life and the fear that that war is spiraling out of control. Thought a little bit about some of those forgotten conflicts, the ones that are not in our media, South Sudan, and then those conflicts that we seem to have always present in our media, the lead up to the US election and the fear and the anxiety that was felt, not only in that country, but around the world. Been a difficult year for peace. And it sort of struck me that choosing peace, choosing to do what Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, it almost felt a little bit unrealistic. And so I want to comment a little bit in the sermon about how our gospel invites us to take difficult situations and to lean into the message of the gospel and the message of Jesus to arrive at a place where we can say, blessed are the peacemakers. A few weeks ago, I was very fortunate to see an old friend from the community of Teze, Brother Emile. He came to Toronto and he spoke, and he said something about this passage that really stuck with me, that I'd never heard before. And he spoke about how in our Gospels, we often think that they're appealing to our will. But instead, he quoted a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who said, the gospel does not appeal to our will, but it appeals to our imagination. And Brother Emile invited me to imagine, and invited all those who were there to imagine. Imagine that what we see on our television sets, what we hear on our radio, what we read in the newspaper, sometimes it can feel so fatalistic. Sometimes it can feel so that this is the narrative where we're going to end up, and we can feel a bit hopeless. Imagine that the gospel will open a space for us to see a different reality. And that made me think a little bit about my in-laws. They're not here, so I get to say what I want about them. My in-laws are from Kitchener, and on my wife's paternal side, they're Dutch, and on the maternal side, they're German. And in fact, my wife's paternal grandfather was conscripted into the German army and sent off to the Eastern Front. And my wife's paternal grandfather fought in the Dutch resistance. And then about 25 years later, their son and daughter decided to start dating. And I thought, I wonder I'm trying to imagine what that moment is like. I've got a German girlfriend. I've got a Dutch boyfriend, just 25 years after these countries went to war. And obviously they got married, so I also wonder what that wedding was like. But we have to imagine what opened up that space so soon after so much horror and destruction. I think that the most important thing that we read in our Gospels is telling us to imagine a reality that other people might not be able to see. We can think of all of the people whose names we're going to read in just a moment. Many, many, many names, including 9 who gave the ultimate sacrifice. Imagine them thinking 20 years after they fought a war, there's going to be this project called the European Union. And suddenly there'll be no borders in Europe and a common currency. Imagine, that's what happened. Could they have believed that in 1945 when they got to come home? Brother Emile comes from a community in France. It's a monastery that was started very recently, in fact, during the events of the Second World War, by a man named Brother Roger. He's certainly a man of imagination. He left Switzerland, because he was Swiss, in 1940, got out his bike and rode into France, got himself all the way to near a town called Cluny, which is right beside Thésée. And he decided to buy a house in France in 1940, even though he was Swiss, and start welcoming refugees, primarily Jewish people fleeing from the Holocaust. I try to imagine what his parents would have said. You're 25, you're going to go into that country and buy a house? Doesn't sound like a great life plan. But he had this imagination that something for peace was possible. And after the war, he had to leave Thésée after he had been denounced to the Gestapo, but after the war he returned. And he and 3 other young men started to serve German prisoners of war, visiting them on Sunday, taking care of their sacramental needs, helping them get the things they need to shave, take care of their clothes, give them a good meal. And I imagine what the people in the villages around those prisoner of war camps thought. What are these crazy monks doing? But I think that Brother Roger imagined that trust could be rebuilt in Europe. And in fact, his whole life ended up being sort of this journey to build trust again in people. He had a very special outlook. He enjoyed young people the most. He thought that we don't listen to young people very often. That might be true. But he had great hope in young people. And he placed great trust in young people to be people who change our societies and change what happens in our world. And by expressing that trust, I think that Brother Roger invited young people to join that imagination that he had. When I showed up in Thésée, I didn't know any of that. Didn't know any of Brother Roger's story, didn't know what he was doing in 1940. But I had some interesting experiences, because I lived with people from all over. Europe, and the world. And there I was at a breakfast table with folks from Germany and from France, Poland, Spain, Portugal, all these places where if you talked with the young men who I lived alongside, for sure, their grandparents, often like our grandparents, were impacted by the war. For sure, their ancestors served. For sure, there's a great uncle who died or a relative who passed away. All of them had that, and here we sat at breakfast together. I think today, as we mark Remembrance Sunday and remember the sacrifices of the past, I think we have to also dare to imagine a bit more. It means taking a risk. Today, we don't like taking risks. We like certainty. We like to know the results. We do some sort of analysis, cost benefit or something else before we go ahead. But I think if we look at our Gospels, Jesus doesn't say any of that to us. He just says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." No analysis statement. And so for me, when I think about making peace today, I try to imagine that when Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he's placing in us trust to take risks for peace, to imagine a world that will be full of peace, to imagine that situations that seem deadlocked can change, to imagine that even simple things like a Dutch boy and a German girl can get married, or that a French boy and a German boy can sit down and have breakfast together. These are things our gospel invites us to imagine. Amen.